Good morning and Chodesh Tov. Today, of course, is the first day of Rosh Chodesh Adar, the first Adar, considering that this year God has graced us with 2 months of Adar, giving us double joy. We all know Adar is, of course, the time when we are joyous, as the Gemara tells us. Mishenichnas Adar, once Adar arrives, we increase in our joy. So by the grace of God, we've been granted 2 such months, 60 full days of joy. Just some background, just the basic level of what we're doing with 2 Adars. I'm sure we're familiar, but just to refresh our memories. Essentially, the months, of course, follow the lunar cycle, the cycle of the moon, which is 29.5 days. And these seasons follow the solar cycle, which is 365 days. So if we have 12 months of the year, following the pattern of the moon, 29.5 days, and then the year follows the cycle of the seasons, which is, of course, the solar system, that's 365 days, then every 12 months, we fall short of reaching to 365 by something 11 days. If anybody here is good at math, you can do that. 29.5 times 12, reaches a little less than 365. So every year, the lunar months will fall a little farther back in the seasons created by the sun, by the solar cycle, thus creating a system where if we were to just stick strictly to 12 months a year, based on the cycle of the moon, every year our holidays would land at a different time in the year. So where Pesach now is in the spring, next year would land 11 or so days earlier than in the season than it did last year, and so on and so forth, leading us eventually to having Pesach in the middle of winter, and then Pesach in the middle of summer, and then Pesach back in the spring. And the Torah tells us that Passover must be in the spring. And therefore, when Adar would arrive back in temple times before they had a fixed calendar, when Adar would arrive, the court would sit and calculate when would the 15th day of Nisan begin? Would it be indeed in spring? And if the answer was no, because it had fallen too far back, it would add a month. So that's the basic reason why Adar is chosen to be the double month, is because it's the one that precedes Passover. The whole reason to add an extra month so that the lunar cycle and the solar cycle match up is to keep Passover, Pesach, in the spring. So the month preceding Pesach is when the court would sit down and discuss whether Pesach lands in the spring or is it too early, and they would add a month accordingly. But of course, it's by divine providence that of all the months of the year, it's the joyous month that precedes Nisan, and thus the joyous month that gets that extra double energy every couple of years, giving us 60 full days of joy. Now, this idea of happiness, of being happy, is a central component in Jewish life and in serving God as a Jew, specifically in the light of Hasidus and what Hasidism brought to the Jewish world. It's well known, the teaching of the Arizal on the verse which reads, Tachas ashaloi avadatas Hashem alakacha b'simcha u'b'tov levav. The verse on its basic meaning means, God says, because when you were happy and you had everything you need, you didn't serve me properly, therefore I'm going to take away all those wonderful things. It's the beginning of the verses that describe the opposite of blessing, the curses, for those who don't serve God, or for when the Jews abandoned God. And the verse begins by saying, because you didn't serve God properly when you had everything, when you were happy and had everything, therefore God's going to take them away, essentially. The Arizal explains, to read the verse like this, because you didn't serve God joyous, that's why the consequences arrive. So where there's in the simple meaning, the word joyous describes the state of the people. They're in a happy circumstance, and the failure is failing to serve God. The Arizal translates and says, no, even if they were serving God, the problem was they didn't do it b'simcha, with joy. So the word with joy is not to describe the circumstance the Jews are in, but rather to describe the state in which they were serving God or lack thereof. So because they didn't serve God with joy, even though they may have been serving God, but they didn't do so joyously, thus comes all these consequences. Thus placing joy as a central tenet in our service of God. And this became a focal point of Hasidus and still is a focal point of Hasidus. Before Hasidism came around, Jewish people were serving God. By and large, many people were, at least many were serving God. But as the previous Rabbi puts it, the Jews were in a state of faint. They lacked enthusiasm, lacked excitement. Not only the simple folk who were uneducated and felt disenfranchised, but even those who were scholarly and truly serving God with great devotion did so with a lack of enthusiasm and joy. The focus was very much a harsh line, self-critical, borderline bitterness to their serving God, considering the angst of not living up to what they could be living up to, and so on and so forth. This led to a very dense form of serving God, a form of serving God that carries this heavy burden. And came the Baal Shem Tov and came Chassidus and reintroduced joy into the service of God. And said, you got to dance, you got to be happy, you got to sing songs. This notion of singing during prayer, which has now become ubiquitous, all Jews do it, is really a Hasidic idea. Before then, you're singing when you're praying. You don't sing when you're praying. When you're praying, you cry. And you got to say the words with all the intensity. And came Chassidus and said, no, sing to God. Be joyous, be happy, dance in your prayer. So Chassidus reintroduced into Judaism the centrality of joy and happiness. Now, as with all ideas in Chassidus, Chabad Chassidus takes a unique approach. The name Chabad, which is comprised of 3 Hebrew letters, Ches, Beis, and Daled, which stands for Chochmah Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, implies that the manner of serving God in the light of Chabad Chassidus is to use the mind. Meaning to say, the objective is not to have an intellectual relationship with God in the abstract. The objective is to have an emotional relationship with God, a joyous one, an emotional, excited one. But the Chabad philosophy posits that the proper way to inculcate and to create this emotional attachment to God is through the mind. It's what Chabad Chassidim refer to as avodah pnimius, internal service. Meaning to say, rather than being inspired by external forces and circumstances, one works within the mind to discover, to learn, to understand, and connect with these lofty and wonderful ideals, to the point that this understanding of these lofty ideals become the means and the creation of our emotional attachment to God. The same thing is true of joy. In Chassidus, one can say, in Chabad Chassidus specifically, one can say, happiness is no laughing matter. Happiness requires deep work, deep avodah, deep meditation, and it starts in the mind. When a person understands what happiness is all about, why they should be happy, what's the motivation and consequence of happiness, why should one be happy? Understanding all of these things will lead to a very internal and sustained joy. Now, to that end, the Alter Rebbe, founder of Chabad Chassidus, in his monumental work, the Tanya, dedicates quite a number of chapters to the subject of joy. Begins in chapter 26, all the way through chapter 34, excluding 32, is dedicated to the question of joy. And this comes before he describes, in chapter 41 and going forward, describes different methodologies of developing love and fear of God. And even before he discusses the question of purpose, before he gets to the purpose of creation and the purpose for why the soul comes down to the body and all of that discussion, which goes from chapter 35 through 40, before that, he discusses the question of joy, beginning in 26 through, as I mentioned, through 34. And the way he structures his discussion on joy is like this. 26, 27, and 28 is dedicated to removing thought processes or things that might cause one to get down. So before he addresses meditations to become joyous, he first discusses ridding the mind of that which causes the opposite of joy, that which causes someone to be depressed or sad, the various different thoughts that might come to a person. He discusses how to deal with that in very specific and detailed manner. 26, 27, 28 goes through how one should contend with thoughts of sadness. Now, 29 and 30, he discusses indifference, someone who feels indifferent. Not that he's feeling sad per se, as he discussed in chapter 26, 27, 28. He discusses someone who feels indifferent, unmotivated. That's discussed in 29 and 30. And those chapters are actually quite harsh. He kind of makes the person look inward and crack the indifference to allow for the emotions to flow. So it gets quite harsh, those two chapters. Then 31, skipping 32, 31, 33, 31, 33, and 34 discuss methodologies of becoming joyous, meditations one can do to gain happiness. 32 in the middle discusses love of your fellow Jew. So what I'd like to do today is give an overview of these chapters 33, 34, 30, 31, 31, 33, and 34, those three chapters that discuss meditations to get joyous. I'd like to give an overview of the various different methods the Alter Rebbe presents that a person can meditate on, ideas a person can meditate on to gain happiness. So that's going to be the objective of today's class. Before we get to that, we have to back up to chapter 26. Chapter 26, which begins this whole discussion on joy, as I mentioned before, 26, 27, 28, deal with how to fend off thoughts of sadness, or how to counter thoughts of sadness, and how to deal with thoughts of sadness. At the beginning of chapter 26, he gives kind of an introduction to that whole section. This whole section of Tanya, from 26 through 35, which discuss happiness and joy and dealing with sadness, he gives a kind of introduction at the beginning of chapter 26. And what he addresses in this introduction is the question of, why should one be happy? Why should I be happy? It's a question we often don't think of asking, because it's so ingrained within us to want happiness that we don't often stop to think, why should I be happy? But the Alter Rebbe addresses that question. Why should I be happy? To what end? What's the point of being happy? And perhaps the way in which the Alter Rebbe answers this question, why should you be happy, actually becomes the foundation for the meditations he's going to present to us later to achieve happiness. It's the shift in thinking about why we should be happy that really serves as the core foundation to achieving happiness in the light of Chabad Hasidus. So let's address the question, why should we be happy? So conventionally, one might answer the question, or not even consciously answer the question, but subconsciously answer the question, why should I be happy? Well, pretty simply because happiness is better than misery, because it's better than the alternative. It's the simple reason why we feel innately a drive, to pursue happiness, because it's better than misery, right? So the premise there is, what's good for me, and I'll choose that. Misery is not good for me. It's miserable, in fact. So I'm going to pursue happiness. Thinking about the pursuit of happiness in this way, what makes me more happy? What's better for me? Well, happiness is better than misery. What that's doing is, what I'm acknowledging here is that happiness doesn't exist inside of me per se. It's out there. Somewhere there is happiness. It's the pursuit of happiness. That's the description, right there in the what is it, Declaration of Independence, or right, the pursuit of happiness. Because happiness is somewhere out there, and I need to pursue it. And that thing out there, whatever that thing is that's going to make me happy, is better for me. because the state I am without that pursuit is miserable, which is the other premise, which is rather jarring. What it's acknowledging is that the baseline state of reality is miserable. That's the baseline state of reality as I have it on its own. And then I got to go out there and find things that are happy for me. Right? So the baseline is miserable. And then if I can find those things that make me happy, I have punctuations, temporary punctuations of happiness throughout my extended life of misery. It sounds very comically doom and gloom, but think about it. If we're pursuing happiness somewhere out there, building on the premise that it's going to make it better for me because the way I am without that pursuit is miserable, it's a pretty grim acknowledgement. My reality as it stands is miserable, and if I can find things out there to make me happy, I'll have temporary punctuations of happiness. But because this becomes the thought process, not necessarily being conscious of it, because this becomes a thought process, what happens is like this. There's one or two alternatives. Let's say one has the means to achieve those punctuations of happiness. Right? So I'm going to get the new car, and it's going to make me happy. I try that new food, it's going to make me happy. And you get the new house, or fill in the blank with 1,000 other things that people pursue in trying to get happy, right? Because inside here, there's no happiness. It's just baseline misery, and I got to punctuate it with a bunch of happy experiences. So a person runs into a very big problem. Besides for the fact that it's a constant up and down. I'm happy, and then I'm going back to my baseline misery, and then I get that happy thing, that new food or the new car, or the deal, whatever it is I'm pursuing, and then go back to my baseline of misery. Besides for that issue, the other issue is the Baal Shem Tov famously taught. I have to get the quote right. Tainug Tmidi Eino Tainug, which means continuous pleasure is no pleasure at all. If you're constantly experiencing something, it's no longer exciting. Right? So if my pleasure and my joy comes from the world outside of me, because inside I don't have it, then as soon as I have enough of that, it becomes my baseline of misery again. So if getting the new car is going to make me happy, so I get the new car, now I'm excited. And now I have the car. It's been a month, it's been 2 months, it's been a year. I still have the car. I'm excited about it now. I'm happy about it. Not anymore. It just became the baseline for my new misery. So I have to find some new punctuation. Get something even more exciting than a car. So I get it. Now I'm excited. It's been a month, it's been 2 months, it's been a year. Now that new thing that I got is now the new baseline of my misery. Because tainuk tmini ene tainuk, continuous joy, continuous pleasure is no pleasure at all. If my delight, if my joy, if my enthusiasm, if my happiness comes from the world outside of me, then as soon as that thing becomes part of my normal life, it becomes a new baseline of my misery. And then I just keep on climbing and climbing and constantly looking to push the envelope more and more so I can get something more thrilling, more exciting, to get me happy again. Because I'm constantly looking for what's good for me, and somehow the world outside has beautiful things that are going to be good for me, and then I'm going to get those things that get me excited. But then when I have them for too long, it just becomes part of the baseline of my new misery, and I find something else and new. And then that becomes part of my new baseline misery, and I got to get something even newer and even newer and even newer, and never ends. So that's one trajectory this might take. If the answer to the question of why should you be happy is because it's better than misery and it makes me feel better, acknowledging then therefore that as I am, it's miserable, and I got to find some happiness out there to make me feel better, then one alternative is I'm going to be chasing thrillers for my whole life, whatever they are, constantly looking for a new punctuation in my misery to find something that's going to make me happy again. In extreme cases, God forbid, this leads to addictions and all kinds of other things. In extreme cases, but even if we don't get that extreme, just the state of hollowness, waiting to be punctuated by some new car, by some new gadget, by some new deal, by some new something that's going to make me happy again. That's one alternative. The other is for the person who can't afford to get those things. What now? So if the pursuit of happiness is to find things out there in the world that make me happy, that make me feel better. What happens if I can't get those things out there? So I'm doomed to that state of misery that I've been born into. It's a big problem. It's a very big problem. Hundreds, maybe thousands of books have been written to solve this issue. How to pursue happiness, how to find sustained happiness. What do we do? And obviously, there isn't one book yet that's popular that just solves all the issues, because new books are being put in after. If we found one book that would somehow solve the problem, everybody would just be happy and we wouldn't have to write new books and buy new books. But there are new books giving new insight on how to achieve happiness and whatnot. And again, I believe that the underlying issue here is addressing the question, why should you be happy? If the answer to the question is because happiness makes me feel better than the state I am before, then you're beginning, the premise is what's in here is miserable, what's out there is happy, and I have to pursue happiness to punctuate my miserable life. And obviously that's not a sustainable solution. It's comically grim. Comes Tanya in the beginning of chapter 26, without going through this entire elaboration I just offered, and answers the question, why should you be happy, in a very different way, almost counterintuitive. He says like this, you know why you should be happy? Because internally, you have a struggle. You have your godly soul, your higher consciousness, your divine consciousness that wants to do the right thing and wants to serve God. You have your animalistic, more base instincts, and your animal soul, as it calls it, more base urges that want to just satisfy the self. And there's a struggle between selfishness and godliness. Now, what happens in a struggle, says the Alter Rebbe, is, say, for example, you have two people wrestling, and one is objectively stronger than the other. But the one who is stronger is feeling sluggish, lazy, and depressed. So the stronger wrestler will no doubt lose. Because to win, you don't just need strength, you also need to be light on your feet. Literally, in a physical wrestle, you have to be light on your feet, you got to be able to move, you got to be excited about the match, excited about the sparring, and then you can win. And therefore, the godly soul, even if it's stronger than the animal soul, it's got God's power. But if it's feeling lazy, if it's feeling depressed, if it's feeling sluggish, it can't win the animal soul, even if it's stronger. And that's why, says the Alter Rebbe, you have to be happy. You think about that? So why should you be happy? Not because it's better than misery, but because that's the way you can properly serve God. It almost sounds as if, theoretically, if the Alter Rebbe was convinced that being depressed would be better for serving God, maybe you should do that. But as so God created it, in order to serve God better, you have to be happy. So now, happiness is not something I pursue out there to make me happy because it's better than the alternative. Happiness is an obligation I have to reach from the inside because I need to serve Him better. Mind shift. Let me zero in on this mind shift. If happiness comes from the outside, things make me happy, then there are really two parts to my life. There's my baseline level of misery where I don't like things, and then there's the happy things that come inside. And the happy things that enter my life are unrelated to the miserable baseline. In fact, they're exact opposite, which is why it's making me happy, because it's the opposite of my baseline misery. Now the Alter Rebbe is telling you, no. The point of your happiness is not to escape the misery. The point of your happiness is so you can fight better. In order for you to win your internal struggle, you have to fight better. In order to fight better, you have to be happy. So the happiness cannot be unrelated to the struggle. It's in the struggle. The happiness cannot be detached from whatever it is I experience. It has to be within that which I experience, within my struggle, not an escape from my struggle, which is temporary, goes away, or that escape becomes my new reality, and then that escape to a higher level of excitement. No, the happiness must be within the struggle itself, because it's the whole point of the happiness. The reason why I should be happy is so I can win my struggle better. So the happiness cannot be detached from my struggle. It has to be in my struggle somehow. And that becomes my obligation. My obligation, not the reward is to be happy, but my obligation is to be happy within my struggle so I can win. What an incredible way of change, a paradigm shift. The happiness is not because somehow something out there is going to make me happier by escaping from my reality, but the happiness is because I have to dig within myself to find a happiness that allows me to contend with my reality and to do better at my reality, not to escape it. Now, to that end, the Alter Rebbe introduces in chapters 31, 33, and 34 different methodologies, different meditations that one can go through to feel to gain happiness. And the common denominator between all the meditations is that they all come from the work. The Alter Rebbe does not say, look at the bright side in life. He doesn't say, oh, find your blessing, count your blessings, and that will make you happy. Because again, that would ignore your struggle. That would mean your happiness comes from one place and your struggle is somewhere else. And you're going to offset your struggle with the happiness you're finding in some other places in life. If the happiness has to come within the struggle, then the happiness can't be find the joys in life or count your blessings, because that would be divorced from the struggle. All of the things that the Alter Rebbe discusses as methods of meditation to gain joy all come from one common theme, which is I have the privilege to serve. My joy comes from the fact that I have the privilege to serve the Creator. I have the privilege to fulfill the purpose for which my soul came to this world. I have the privilege to fulfill the purpose for which God created the world. This is not divorced from my reality. That is my reality. If the purpose for my creation is to fight in the deepest part of myself, then that's where my joy comes from. Because I can serve God even in that struggle, or not just even, in that struggle. Just to zero in this for a second before we get to the methods of what meditation to take to get to gain happiness. When we think of happiness this way, not as something outside makes me happy, some joy in life that punctuates in between the rest of my miserable states of living, but when I think of happiness as the privilege I have to serve within the struggles of my life, then my joy, my happiness, is not a contradiction to my stresses. They're not. If happiness comes from, the car I get or the food I eat, then there's a contradiction in my life. There's the stress here. I'm going to block it out and entertain my happiness temporarily until I get back to my stresses. But if my happiness is the privilege that I get to serve within the struggle, then it's in those very stresses where you find the happiness. While I'm stressing about whatever it is I have to get done, if my mind remembers and I meditate on this idea that the burden I am carrying is in the service of God, and that burden is the ultimate purpose for why I was created, then that burden itself becomes the source of joy, not contradictory to my joy. It becomes the source of my joy. And then I can carry the burden all the much better. Getting back to the point you mentioned earlier, that when the wrestler feels light and excited, he's more likely to win than if he feels heavy and depressed and sad. I can carry the burden of my life all the more because I understand and I remember that it is in the burden that I have the privilege to serve the ultimate purpose for everything that exists, including the purpose for my own creation and the purpose for which God created the world. This is the underlying theme of all the methodologies that the Alter Rebbe tells us in meditating our way to happiness. So I'm going to go through it essentially in 5 stages, 5 different meditations the Alter Rebbe gives to inculcate and bring about joy. Number 1, this comes in chapter 31. After chapter 29 and 30, where, as I mentioned before, the Tanya is rather harsh. 29 and 30, the Alter Rebbe discusses indifference. And the response to indifference is looking at oneself in the mirror, as the Alter Rebbe explains there at length, and reminding oneself of how much work there is to be done. So it's rather harsh on the person, cracking the shell of indifference. And then from there, he goes to chapter 31 and says, it's true that you have all this stuff to work on, and it's true there's all this ugliness in your life. But buried beneath that ugliness is a pure divine soul. And that pure divine soul is uncorrupted by all the ugliness that exists. And you and I have been granted the opportunity, number 1, to have that pure soul within us. And number 2, we've been granted the opportunity to dedicate our lives to the purity of that goodness, to the purity of our souls. We could, if we want to, access that pure, good, divine soul and allow it freedom, notwithstanding all the ugliness I may have, brought upon myself. And this, the Alter Rebbe describes, is the joy of like coming out of jail, coming out of exile. The soul is stuck in this body of selfishness and self-indulgence, and the soul is stuck there beneath all of this ugliness. And when I give it a breather, it's like I'm bringing it out of jail. I'm allowing it to breathe. I'm doing a mitzvah. I'm giving it some expression. I'm taking the godly soul who has been so far removed and detached from its source, from God itself, and allowing it to reconnect to God. There's no greater joy than that, says the Alter Rebbe. It's like coming out of jail. It's like a guy who was stuck in jail, yanked out and brought back to his parents' table. So it is with the soul that's stuck in this body that is selfishly motivated. Then all of a sudden I give the soul its expression in Torah and mitzvahs, and I reconnect it to God. It's no greater joy than that. Allowing the soul to emerge and rise up from the shell of selfishness that I may have pursued previously. Furthermore, says the Alter Rebbe, even the fact that I am built selfish, I didn't make myself that way. That's the way God made it. So I have to beat myself up over it. God made it such a way that I have this struggle. Okay, he made it that way. That's just the way it is. Now let me dedicate my life to fulfilling what it's supposed to be done in the struggle. Dedicating my life to allow my soul to express itself. This meditation, says the Alter Rebbe, is the great joy of teshuvah. The joy of not ignoring the ugliness of the past, acknowledging it and recognizing that's just the way God made the world, that people do ugly and stupid things. And notwithstanding all that, he embedded within us a pure, divine, godly soul that can get a breather the moment I allow it to. It can be reconnected to its true source, to God, the moment I allow it to, which is what teshuvah is. So this is method number 1. The Alter Rebbe describes meditation number 1 to achieve joy, to meditate on the notion that the godly soul is incarcerated in the indulgence of the body, and to allow it freedom by dedicating our lives to serving God. From there, the Alter Rebbe goes in chapter 34 and then 35 to discuss various different manners in which I can serve God and allow the soul to express itself, gaining that joy. And the first level he gives here is one that requires no exterior stimuli, no external stimuli. If we talked about before, happiness that comes from the outside, that gives me happiness, this is the exact opposite. He describes a joy that comes from just my thoughts. And there he says like this: the ultimate purpose for creation as I'm sure we're all aware, as Chassidus enlightens us, is to make a home for God in this world. A home for God in this world, says the Alter Rebbe, begins in the mind. My mind, which exists right here in this physical world, if it decides to think about the faith and oneness of God. Chassidus has spilled lots of ink on many pages to explain at great length what the oneness of God is, and that's not the subject of our discussion now, to understand the oneness of God. But once I've learned that, I've learned about the oneness of God because I've studied some Chassidus. I've been privileged enough to learn that. And I spend the next 5 minutes thinking about that. That's all I'm doing. I'm envisioning in my mind. That's what he uses that word, envision, to mitzayir, to picture in my mind what the oneness of God looks like. Then in that moment, says the Alter Rebbe, I am fulfilling the purpose of creation of making a home for God, because I've made a home for God in my mind. The language he uses there is, you become God's personal host. The moment you spend 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 30 seconds thinking about the oneness of God's presence, that thought itself serves to be God's home, and you become God's host. What greater joy than that? Become God's host? This explains why Hasidim, who were sent in some gulag in Russia somewhere, remained happy. They didn't have their tefillin. They couldn't keep Shabbos. They were forced labor. No families around, nothing. And they're still happy. Why? Because God's still here. And God gave me the ability to think about him. God gave me the ability to host him in my mind. No one gave it to me. No one can take it away. The circumstantial joy we described before, the joy that comes from the world outside, it comes and goes. I get used to it and it becomes my new misery. But my thoughts and the ability that my soul has to connect to God in my mind, no one gave it to me. No one can take it away from me. It's God's gift, and the most precious gift of all, that I'm capable of sitting and thinking about God. This itself, says the Alter Rebbe, is a reason for joy. So if I have to struggle in my mind to focus for 30 seconds, and that struggle is the ultimate beauty there is in the world. Moreover, this gets to the next layer of joy, is remembering how happy God is in that moment. Not just the privilege I have to be God's host, but God is thrilled to be hosted by me. God is overjoyed that a soul of his is re-inviting him into his life. When my soul, re-invites God into my life by thinking about him, God is overjoyed. The soul that I put in this world is inviting me back in. I can't believe it, says God. So remembering that not only I have the ability to be God's host, but in fact, God is super happy to be my guest. That in and of itself is a whole nother level of joy. And from there, the Alter Rebbe goes on to describe that if God grants me the ability to do mitzvahs and learn Torah, not just because I'm not stuck in a jail somewhere in Russia where all I have is my thoughts. Thank God I have the ability here in Canada to serve God, to wear my tefillin every day, to keep Shabbos every week, to eat kosher, to give tzedakah. I've been granted the ability to do all of this stuff for God. And the more I have to fight to get those things done, the greater the joy. Because look at that. I've been granted the opportunity as a little human being in this world to fulfill God's purpose, to invite him into my life. What greater joy can there possibly be than that? And finally, he concludes, it's not only in my moments of Torah and mitzvahs that I get that joy. I can't believe I get to be God's personal host, and can't believe I get to fulfill God's purpose for creation. But even when I eat, drink, when I go about my daily business, if all of that is done with the ultimate goal so I can serve God better, I drink the water so I can serve God better, I have my business and thank God, God's blessed the business, and now I can give charity and help others, then my entire business now becomes a home for God. My eating and drinking became a home for God. My whole life became a home for God. All the burdens and the stresses I have to carry in this world, they themselves become the means of my happiness, because that is where I make my relationship with God. that is where I become God's host, in those stresses, in those burdens. This is the kind of joy. It's not subject to circumstance. It's not a punctuation of, my miserable state of being, and it gets punctuated by a couple of happy things I do, a new car, a new this, and new that. But it's the kind of happiness that comes with a switch in the way I think about my life, and specifically the way I think about happiness. Not happiness as something the world ought to give me so that I can escape my misery, but happiness that I create from the inside, from within the struggles and the burdens of my life. I understand and recognize that all of this is part of my serving God, and that itself, the very life itself that I have to carry, the very life itself that I struggle through, that itself becomes the ultimate joyous experience that can never be taken away by anybody. Because only God gave it to me, and only He can take it away. So even as I go about my life and contend with all kinds of things that we all have to contend with, all of those things become infused, and they themselves become the source of joy, understanding, recognizing, and remembering that is where I fulfill my ultimate purpose. That is where I invite God into my life. And that is where God ultimately gets His greatest joy, overjoyed and ecstatic that we've invited Him into our lives. So with that, I'll thank you all for listening and wish you all 60 days of joy that should be ever increasing on all levels. And we don't have to, God willing, we won't have to find joy in struggle, but just open and reveal joy. We don't have to work too hard to find, because it's going to be there while we easily and joyfully and happily serve God, taking the strength from other for the rest of the year.
Rabbi, I knew that was amazing. That was so good. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi Levi.
Very inspiring.
You have a good day. And a Chodesh for everybody.
Yeah,
Same
Chodesh Tov.
Same
Chodesh Tov.
blessings for you, Rabbi Levi.
Thank you.
It was
We
really
return the
beautiful.
blessings to you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you so much. Really
Shkoyach.
Thank
heart.
you.
Right, Tina.